This is fourth quarter Paideia response. The book I chose was The Heart of Darkness, and I'll just get right into it. In The Heart of Darkness, its central points have to deal with imperialism and the way we view others in their own respective cultures. Marlowe is the main protagonist, and his main goal is to sail the Congo and get to Mr. Kurtz. This was all tasked by a place he worked for called the Company, or as he referred to it as the Company. During his adventure, he encounters brutality and inefficiency in the Company's stations because the Company has enslaved the indigenous peoples of the Congo, and this and other instances later on in the book make him and the rest of his company reflect on how the modern man looks and perceives others from their respective cultures. Excuse me. Another underlying theme or major key of this book is the imperialistic theme of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the hypocrisy of imperialism, and also how much of the earth was conquered through imperialism by European powers, but their power was spread so thin. Because it was spread so thin, things like riots and wars and commercial abandonment of agriculture became very prevalent and threatened the white man living in the far corners of the earth. And so with that notion, and what this book hints at, is that this chaos is a natural result of when men are given power like this. And so the next question I chose was the character one. And so my most favorite character in this book would definitely have to be Marlowe, because he is the epitome of an honest guy and all-around good guy. Reason being is because he tells stories all the time, and people gravitate towards him while he's telling his stories because of his capabilities. And so on page 11, the last paragraph, it says, Marlowe is telling a story, and he says, "I got my appointment," and there's some in there that I cut out. And it says, appears the company had received news that one of their captains had been killed in a scuffle with the natives. This was my chance, and it made me more anxious to go on his trip. And so Marlowe told this story to the rest of his companions, and they started gravitating towards him because he had amazing story capabilities. And so he had told his story about how he was actually chosen for the mission, and the details of what happened to the rest of happened. And he explains this to the rest of his crew, and I think that's why he's my favorite character. He tells this story right after they board and set sail for the Congo and wherever Mr. Kurtz is in the River Thames. And the least likable character in this book, the award has to go to Mr. Kurtz, because he is the quintessential bad guy or supervillain, I guess you could say. And he's a very clever and cunning and mad man. So on page 92 and 93, there's a perfect example of why Kurtz is such an unlikable person. Marlowe is excuse me. Marlowe's piecing together all the details of how Kurtz sent the indigenous peoples after them, and is being told a story by a person in his company who's interacted with Kurtz, and that person says they, or meaning the people, the indigenous people, adored him. He could be very terrible, and you cannot judge Mr. Kurtz as you would any ordinary man. No, no, no. Now, just to give you an idea, I don't mind telling you. He wanted to shoot me, too, one day, but I don't judge him. Shoot you, Marlowe cried, but what for? He said, well, I had a small lot of ivory the chief of that village near my house gave me. You see, I used to shoot game from him. Well, he wanted it, and wouldn't hear reason. He declared that he would shoot me unless I gave him the ivory, and then cleared out of the country, because he could do so, and had a fancy for it. And there was nothing on the earth that prevented from killing from whom he jolly well pleased. And it was true, too, and I gave him the ivory. And so this is just a very strong evidence to say that Mr. Kurtz is a not very good man, and I would not like to be his friend, because you could say. And so the next part, I chose the greatest flaw. And so the greatest flaw in this book is that it's actually kind of short. I wouldn't have much it would have been better if it were longer and had a lot more instances where we could see more of the theme developing. And in only about 130 pages, there's a whole story that gives a very complex and well thought out plot and storyline, and that's one of its major strengths. But besides that point, there's a very plenty of detail in the book, but I think it could have been drug out a bit longer because it feels too fast paced. Marlowe at the beginning is already going on his trek with his little company and says that he says on page 5, it says that he's usually a seaman, and he did go for a riverman for a while, and this is one of his stories also. After that, it kind of immediately transitions into his trek and him and his little company, and his band of people, and the purpose of the task he was given. After that, it becomes really fast paced, and the climax begins to occur with the indigenous peoples being sent by Kurtz and I'll talk about that later. And it says to attack Marlowe and the vessel, and some fatal wounds actually occur. And it just keeps getting faster and faster from that point, and I think it would have been a lot more beneficial to give little cliffhangers and then start on a different topic and go to the next one. The greatest strength of this novel is definitely the fine detail in almost every sentence. For instance, in the beginning, Joseph Conrad paints this beautiful picture of the sun through Marlowe. And he says, "The sun sank low, and from glowing white changed to a dull red without rays and without heat, as if about to go out suddenly, stricken to death by the touch of that gloom brooding over the crowd of men." And so this is a perfect example of one of the major strengths of this book. It's because it's so full of detail that it may also be its moral flaw, because it makes it very fast-paced too. But besides that point, it's so full of detail that the reader gets so into the book, and I think that's the greatest strength of the book, because of all of the detail that it actually goes into. And so the next question arises: that should this book be banned from public schools? And I say the answer is no. This is a very good AP worthy book, and it's beneficial to students' overall advanced education, such as AP Lang, for the next class next year that I'm taking. For instance, I read this book for this honors class, and it should stay in schools for other people to read, because this book has underlying themes of imperialism and the hypocrisy of imperialism. And that's a good thing to learn about, because other people that have more advanced classes, they can connect it with whatever they're learning with in that class, and that just makes it a stronger connection, so that you can remember these things and get better scores on everything. And then the next question I did was, there are multiple big surprises in this book, but the biggest surprise is finding out that Kurt sent the band of indigenous peoples after Marlowe's group. Indigenous people after Marlowe's group. And so what happened was, Marlowe's group came to like a hut with a note for their group, and with firewood there. And after that, they kind of got jumped by a bunch of natives of the Congo, and the helmsman died. Excuse me. And some others were almost fatally wounded. But besides that, this was a great surprise, because Marlowe was sent to find Kurtz, and Kurtz is one of the modern men like Marlowe. So logically, it wouldn't make sense as to why he would try to kill Marlowe without the background knowledge of how the indigenous people thought he was a god, and he had to maintain this status. So I think that is the most prevalent instance of where, and it was very surprising. And on page 82, he explains to Marlowe, "We approach them with the might of a deity. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded." And this quote really explains how Kurtz is trying to justify his actions. Further, uh, explaining my point that he's not a good person, and also trying to also trying to make my point that this was a big surprise because he's trying to justify his actions, that he had to maintain his status. And for the very last question, I decided to do the theme song question. And to be completely honest, there actually could be a good theme song to this. And the theme song would cover how beautifully, the beautiful scenery from the book, and can be that can be coupled with the actual darkness that is in the jungle of the book. And I'll explain what it means by darkness in a second. And so the song would go a little something like this: the sun sets. Oh, how the sun sets! But as beautiful as it is, the men in the vessel, oh, how they fret. The savages, oh, how they come, and this is the darker part because, and kind of the hypocrisy of imperialism. The savages, oh how they come from a friend with bad intentions, bum bada bum. And so this is a good theme song for this book because it shows you how everything can be real pretty within the details and everything, but in reality, it shows how other people react to other cultures and the hypocrisy of imperialism.